Hey, welcome back everybody. Mike here. Apologies if I sound a little off. I am definitely sick. But you know what else is sick? Azure Regions and Availability Zones. Red Bull, iguanas, and Mexico. I'm dumbfounded. Why would I say that? I feel like I'm going to regret this. 85% chance I'm going to regret it. Whew. Okay, we're not sick. We're not sick. All right, but in all seriousness, welcome back everybody. As I said, today we're gonna talk about Azure Regions and Availability Zones. What the heck are they? Why should you care about them? All of that stuff. And we're gonna draw it out. And I'm actually going to show you in the Azure Portal as well. So that said, we're here to talk about Availability Zones and Regions. So let's get right to it. So the first thing we're gonna start with is a region. What the heck is a region within Azure? Well, a region within Azure, in my own definition, is a grouping of data centers within some sort of geographic boundary, such as the Western US, Eastern US, that sort of thing. And who decides this? Well, it's Microsoft. They decide where these boundaries are, and oftentimes it's based on some kind of latency measurement. So the idea is that we could run ultimately our resources, and our resource in Azure means it could be a virtual machine, it could be storage, it could be a whole number of different things, right? But we could potentially run our resources in a region, and we could set up failover or disaster recovery from region to region. So we could theoretically run our app in the Western US, and if the entire region fails, we could fail over to the Eastern US. Now that's pretty complicated, but that kind of gives you a high level idea. So if I were to draw it out, we would say that's the region, right? And maybe, I use the Western US example, so let's make this West US. And by the way, there are several regions. Like in the East, I know there's actually East US 1, 2, and 3. So this is just one example. But let's say we have West US, or that could be East US, it really doesn't matter. And in this case, we have this concept of a region, and a region has those data centers inside of it that I talked about, right? Well, technically what's inside of a region in most cases is referred to as an availability zone. So I'm going to put availability zone, and I feel like I missed an I there. All right, so an availability zone, and by the way, in pretty much every region that supports AZs or availability zones, you'll have 3. So these kind of red rectangles represent, we'll say, AZ1, that's availability zone 1, availability zone 2, and of course AZ3. Now inside of an availability zone, we can have one or multiple data centers. And in most cases, it would be multiple. And just to kind of give you a little idea, I'll just kind of draw this real tiny. And these data centers would have independent cooling, power, network, all of that. But oftentimes they are within 2 milliseconds of each other, according to Microsoft. So they are pretty close to each other physically, but the whole point is they provide some level of redundancy for the other data centers within that availability zone. Now the good news is you don't really have to worry about this too much, but there are implications here when we talk about availability zones in terms of disaster recovery, but we'll get to that. But what I will say is that availability zones are separated enough within a region that things like local weather events, natural disasters, that sort of thing should not affect other availability zones within our region. There's this concept in Azure of zonal, let me see if I can get a good color here. There we go. Zonal resources. That means a resource is tied to an AZ or an availability zone. So for example, if I deploy a VM, so I'll just draw a VM here. If I deploy that and I say I'm going to deploy it to AZ3, at the end of the day, it's going to stay in AZ3 and it's going to land in one of these data centers. I'll just draw a little square to represent it, right? That is the VM. It is ultimately running on a server in one of these data centers. I don't get to pick specifically which data center, but I can pick the availability zone. Now, in the case of VMs, they would be referred to in this example as zonal, because what this ultimately means is, well, what happens if I lose that data center? My VM goes down, right? Now, I can definitely, there's some solutions such as availability sets and scale sets that can help alleviate some of this problem, which again, we're going to talk about in another video. But the point here is that if I really want redundancy, and again, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of, disaster recovery and all of that, what I would ideally do is, potentially deploy multiple copies of that VM, right? Maybe even deploy other copies in other availability zones, and maybe even set up replication and that sort of thing to make sure that however I set it up, that my VMs are going to be protected in the event of a failure. So yes, one VM can only exist, technically one instance of it, but we can set up an application to run across availability zones and that sort of thing. So hopefully that makes sense. Now I will say, according to Microsoft, if you do what I drew here on the screen, where we have the VMs set up across availability zones, even just 2 VMs, so we have a VM in AZ1, a VM in AZ2, Microsoft says that will bring you 99.9% availability. That's pretty darn good if you ask me. Now, if you do only one instance of a VM within one availability zone, ultimately that means sitting on a server somewhere, I believe they promise you, 99.9%, which is still really good, but obviously for a mission critical application, we'd probably want to set up replication, use availability sets or scale sets to kind of, be able to handle some greater kind of issues that we might encounter, right, within the data center. Things like hardware failure, floods, fires, sabotage, all kinds of stuff, right? All right, so that said, I want to jump into the Azure portal and let's continue the conversation there. All right, so here we are at the Azure homepage, azure.microsoft.com. Now, what we want to do is look at the regions. I just want to show you first, before we go into the portal and actually set up a VM, I want to show you the regions. So you can find that off of the homepage by going to Explore, then to Global Infrastructure. From there, you'll then click on Geographies right here. You can also get here by just Googling this right here, Azure Geographies, and that should bring you to the same page. But if we go down, what I want to show you is right here. So you can see it at the top here, it has a listing of some countries. And we can click this drop down here as well for other options. But in this case, we see it's defaulting to the United States because that's where I'm at. Now at the top here, this is the name of each region. So we have Central, East US 1, 2, 3. We can see 3 is coming soon. We have North Central, South Central US, West Central, West US, and West US 2 and 3. Now if I just pick one of these, we go down. First, it shows us the location. We see the year it opened. Not real useful in my opinion, but it's good to know, I guess. We also see availability zones presence, and we see available with 3 zones. This is pretty much across the board, that if a region supports AZs, you'll see 3. In this case, if we scroll over, we see, for example, South Central US has been open since 2000, or I'm sorry, not South Central, North Central US right here has been open since 2009, but does not support availability zones. So just keep that in mind if you were wanting to deploy into that region and you wanted to take advantage of that high SLA by spreading your workload across availability zones, you can't do it in that specific region, right? So just some things to think about. The other thing that is kind of useful is if you go down, it says data residency. This is one of the biggest determining factors when picking a region is where do you want your data stored? So just keep that in mind. The one thing I'll point out here also, specifically for those of you studying for the AZ-900 exam, that's the Azure Fundamentals exam. If you go to like Azure Government, you'll notice, let me see, right, data residency, this right here. See how it says sovereign offering, physically isolated instance of Microsoft Azure, right? So that is basically saying that it is Azure and it's deployed the same way and you use it the same way, but it's a completely separate instance from what you and I use. And that's for Azure Government. In addition to that, if we go up here and we change this drop down to like, let's do China, you will see the same thing here. So it says here, right here, a sovereign offering independent dedicated network within China. So just keep it in mind that, when it comes to the exams, occasionally you'll get questions around, different region types and sovereign versus not sovereign and availability zones and all that. I will say that for the exam, I wouldn't expect that you need to necessarily, memorize any of this. This is more just for you to understand kind of the options out there. I want to flip into the portal and let's deploy a VM real quick, and I want to show you where the region and the availability zones come into play. All right, so here we are at the Azure portal, logged into my test account. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time here on this channel, so I'm not going to go through a whole lot, but in our case, we'll head over to resource groups, and I'll show you I do have one resource group here called Demo Resource Group, or RG. Now, a resource group in Azure is just essentially a container for resources that we want to lifecycle together. So, a resource in Azure, by the way, could be a virtual machine, a network interface, a network security group, that's essentially firewall policy, could be a disk. There's a whole number of things, right? Just about anything in Azure is a resource. So a resource group holds all of that together. And one of the cool things is if we ever decide that we don't need, say I create a resource group for my pizza app, right? And I put all of my web VMs, my database VMs or services, all that in that resource group. If I decide tomorrow I'm done with that, entire application, I can actually just delete the resource group as a whole and it'll delete everything within it. I think I drank too much Red Bull. So anyway, the point here is that resource groups are very handy in terms of kind of organizing our resources within Azure. Now that said, in our case, if I go to Demo Resource Group, Demo RG here, I see that I have no resources right here. So I'm going to create a really quick VM. Again, this video is not about how to create a VM in Azure. I just want to show you specifically where the region and resource group, or rather availability zones, come into play. And you'll see that here. So we'll go through the first half of creating that VM. To create a VM in Azure, we just go to Create and then go to Azure Virtual Machine right here. All right, the first thing we'll see here, it says subscription. Which subscription do we want to create this under? Obviously, we could have a user with access to multiple subscriptions. Maybe we have a prod subscription, dev subscription, so on. We also specify a resource group. If you leave this to the default, it will create its own resource group. I'm going to change that. I don't like that. I want that to land in my demo resource group, so there we go. For name, I'll name it, let's say db-server 1. I don't know. I'm just picking something at random. Here's where region starts to come into play. And again, this is just an example for a VM, but just about every other Azure service will be asked about regions and potentially availability zones as well. So in this case, I select East US. If I don't want that, I can deploy this into any other region I want. Really, the question comes down to, where do you want to put your resources? Where do you want them located at? In this case, East US is fine for me. Next, you'll see availability options. It says availability zone, and it says physically separate your resources within an Azure region. So if I leave it selected there, I can then click the link below that dropdown that says zone 1, 2, or 3. And that's going to allow me to decide specifically which AZ in this region do I want this VM to deploy into. So for example, if let's say we have that VM right there. So we'll say we have AZ1, we have AZ2, and AZ3. So really this is asking us, where do you want that to go? And in this case, it's defaulting here. Now, if I check other AZs, you would think that potentially, I don't know what you would think actually, but if I went over here and I said, let's check that, what would ultimately happen is it would actually deploy a copy of that VM here, here, and here. So they're ultimately technically separate VMs, of course. These would be, if we were numbering them, right? This one would be 1, 2, 3. These are separate VMs, but they are created from the same base instance or image that we would be specifying right below. So you see where it says Ubuntu right there. That's where they would be created from. So we could do that for redundancy purposes. We still have to think about replicating storage and that kind of thing, and maybe application state between VM instances and all that. But for the sake of this argument, all we're really interested in is this determines where we deploy this VM within that one region, right? So within East US, do we want AZ 1, 2, or 3? If I click 2, you'll see right here it changes. It says DB server 1-1 and then 1-2. So it's automatically going to deploy two VMs for me. And we can actually see it says that right here. If you take the time to read this message, it just basically says, hey, I see you're deploying multiple VMs. And there's other things, other ways within Azure we can do that. One is called availability sets. The other is called scale sets. We will do, I'll do a video on that. We'll talk all about those in another video. But for today, that's really what I wanted to show you, is that we do have the flexibility to select which AZ we deploy into, and region, of course. And like I said, this will filter into all the other Azure services. So understanding regions and AZs is going to be kind of a pretty foundational topic for your knowledge, in terms of building your expertise, we'll say, in Azure. All right, so that's all I got for you guys today. I hope you found this video useful. It is awesome to be back. Obviously, I'm sick as anything, and I'm still recording, so that tells you how much I'm excited to be doing this again. I wouldn't be doing anything else. So thank you for the support. Like the video if you found it useful. Share it with your friends, post it, whatever. That said, I hope you're all staying safe and healthy, and until next time, stay nerdy and stay healthy. Please don't, wash your hands on that. No, I mean, do wash your hands, but stay healthy while you do it, and after. And vitamin C.